Hello, this is my sixth podcast relating to the terrifying subject of colonialism and imperialism, developed in Russia and Europe, that brought about and still brings about horrifying consequences, such as the institution of slavery in the past and pillaging of our precious earthly resources today. Please hear now my sixth podcast showing how imperialist and colonialist movements hurt the environment so much. The work of past American presidents has taught us that European and Russian imperialism and colonialism are virulent government and societal practices and programs that violate the homeland, its soil, and even the very seeds of the land, and the peoples of nations practicing agrarian forms of life. When one studies the philosophies of Presidents James Monroe, Harry S. Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton, as stated in their presidential doctrines, which illuminate American policy when acting in foreign affairs, one sees a steadfast commitment to protect agrarian, quote, third world, unquote, countries who have traditionally been exploited by the European and Russian colonialists and imperialists. Lands are being destroyed for the want of their mineral resources, left unable to grow vegetation and food, leading many native populations to starve. Forests are being cut down for the want of their great ability to build numerous consumer goods, and populations are being harnessed by mega-sized stock market-listed businesses to work for the colonialists as the cheapest form of labor. This last activity represents a modern slave trade or feudalist system in the agrarian homelands being exploited and hosting modern businesses whose cultures are antithetical to their own, all happening under the guise of modernization and the guise of a helping hand from a richer nation. In reality, there is plunder and enrichment of the superpower nations who move into the native lands, and the enrichment of the land is clearly to the benefit of the colonialist, imperialist governments and not to the benefit of those living on the lands. American presidents have always opposed these conquests, and this author believes our assassinated leaders may have died for working to stop colonialist and imperialist subjugation of agrarian people. What this article explores is if super wealthy stock market business movements into agrarian lands fertile with earthly resources, tended there by gentle populations for centuries, constitutes another form of colonialism and imperialism. While the stock market listed companies, home countries, governments may not be politically or militarily involved in the plunder of the native lands and peoples, a new form of colonialist and imperialist oppression may be taking place to rob lands, just as the old cadre of traversers had done, of their immense values of energy, iron ore, gold, metals, and more. What now exists under cover of modern corporate expansion into Africa, to name one continent, is, this author feels, just a continuation of the long-standing earth policy of subjugation by northern supremacists of their southern neighbors for the riches of their lands and the wealth that those priceless resources can provide. These business concerns, seemingly coming from every industrialized nation, bringing along their multitudes of wealth accrued from stock market investors, have the power necessary to buy their way into any country. Following a premeditated program of legal conquest and plundering are German businesses, whose plans for these actions started after World War II, when they lost the war and the world believed that they were conquered. Instead, some Germans living in Spain and South America took another tack, to conquer not through military means, but instead to conquer through land takeover and natural resource robbery under the guise of economic entry into the coveted countries, setting up shop, for example, in Africa as friendly businesses, with the true motives being to gain control of the fertile African land. Other countries' stock market hyper-expansionist companies also do their share, perhaps some without even realizing that they too are acting in the old colonialist and imperialist ways despised by American presidents. This is a very sad reality, since our presidential doctrines were illuminated, standing steadfastly against the horror and damages of European and Russian colonialism and imperialism, that still today such warlike aggressive movements still exist from industrialized, modern countries perpetrating against agrarian populations. This author believes that the U.S. government should study American stock market listed companies' business advances and denounce those companies following expansionist programs into agrarian lands, bringing an unwanted culture of consumerism and land excavation for the sake of luxurious lifestyles as un-American. American companies should be scrutinized now to find ways to stop any aggressive plunder of other countries' lands, so in so many ways is condoned by stock market philosophies. The colonial and imperial actions in Africa are so severe that a definition of the term looting has been developed by the Internet Dictionary Wikipedia to describe the expansion of economic forces into Africa today. Looting in Africa is described as sacking, plundering, despoiling, despoliation, and pillaging. Is the indiscriminate taking of goods by force as part of a military or political victory, or during a catastrophe such as war, natural disaster, or rioting. The term is also used in a broader sense to describe egregious instances of theft and embezzlement, such as the plundering of private or public assets by corrupt or greedy authorities. Another term arising from the centuries-old programs of plundering African soil and lives there is called kleptocracy, derived from the word kleptomania, an incurable disease of thievery that describes governments and governmental programs set up to base their wealth accrual upon the thievery of others. As described in Wikipedia, a kleptocracy is a form of political and government corruption where the government exists to increase the personal wealth and political power of its officials and the ruling class at the expense of the wider population, often with the pretense of wider service. Kleptocracies are generally associated with corrupt forms of authoritarian governments, particularly dictatorships, oligarchies, military juntas, or some other form of autocratic or nepotist government in which no outside oversight is possible due to the ability of the kleptocrats to personally control both the supply of public funds and the means of determining their dispersal. The above described types of vastly corrupt governments and their activities are abhorrent to American philosophies as expressed in our presidential doctrines outlining the American stance towards foreign affairs, and particularly our stance in regard to what we call illegal expansionism into other cultures' lands to form kleptocratic methods of government there. If Americans, then, were to participate in kleptocratic activities, they would be considered un-American. If, then, any U.S. stock market listed company is following these types of programs, our government must ban their activities, stop them from continuing, and remove their businesses from the cadre on the stock exchange perpetrating these kleptocratic activities. Kleptocracy is most commonly practiced against developing countries whose economies come to be based, according to the kleptocrats, on the export of natural resources. Such export incomes come to constitute a form of economic rent paid from the indigenous peoples to the wealthier nations' businesses set up there to take vastly important resources from their land. The term kleptocracy developed along with the German term Raubwirtschaft, German for plunder economy, robber economy, and rapine. This describes a form of economy where the goal is to plunder the wealth and resources of a country or geographical area. The term Raubwirtschaft is often used to describe some late 19th century colonial and post-colonial practices during the, quote, scramble for Africa, unquote, describing the takeover of Africa for economic power and wealth, obviously as delineated among German people. The phenomena of Raubwirtschaft was codified as a united European program by the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, which regulated European colonialization and trade in Africa, at the same time that Germany arose as an imperialist power. Rob Wirtschaft is even applied to the phenomenon known as rainforest destruction, according to Wikipedia, showing a conscious premeditation and plan by Europeans for the gain of the few to remove the world's rainforests, so important for the agrarian cultures living among them for survival, and also so important to the entire earth for their work in cooling our climate and bringing moisture and rainfall, and indeed participating greatly in the continuous earthly water cycle. There are also Russian terms similar to kleptocracy, including kratocracy, rule based on the desire for material gain, and krematizamonocracy, ruled by those who transact business for their own profit. Later in this article, proof will be presented of Russian taking control of land in an agrarian land that led to its suffering. Going further into the idea of robbery of environments, another telling term has arisen, according to Wikipedia, called science policy colonization, which states that science policy is increasingly being dominated by scientific experts from developed, industrialized democracies. Scientists from poorer, emerging, or developing democracies may mainly be given the role of collecting raw data. Experts of developed, industrialized democracies who feel a natural, almost God-given right to control the environmental policies of underdeveloped or agrarian nations follow their own government's agendas when creating policies for the environments of the native lands that they control. This author believes a science policy based on obtaining the greatest riches possible from the earth in as quickly a manner as is possible is the backbone of industrialized modern countries' science policies, moving at this rapid and inhumane way to satisfy the insatiable needs of stock market type companies that must keep growing at an alarming rate in order to create false consumer demand for products made only to have something to do with the inordinate amount of funding these companies receive. This falsely heightened consumer demand has little bearing to the true innate business plans and the innate consumer demand of the stock market giants' true business cycles at home. Wikipedia states that exports from modern nations may have unchallenged biases that run counter to the best interests of emerging democracies, showing that developed countries may use their own science policies as a basis for allowing them to exploit the environments of emerging cultures whose own science policies, if allowed to be explored and heard, might defend and protect their lands. Indeed, articles abound that show how many developed countries' donations to Africa's aid does not match amounts of money taken away as Africa is robbed of its natural resources by many of the same countries' businesses, siphoning off the value of the land. Also, loans are made to Africa for development by the same countries that plunder the land whose people are bestowed with such gifts behind the fronts of multinational corporations who avoid even paying taxes through the setup of complicated offshore business schemes that African people do not understand and that are not a part of the African way of life. There are always, of course, average citizens across the globe who with open hearts give to Africa and other suffering populations. However, from the same citizens' home countries come wealthy stock market listed, mega rich and mega powerful companies who influence their homeland government's policies in order to debase the wishes of the average man that includes concern for suffering population, as proven in America, where our presidents delineated our hopes for the world's poor in their foreign affairs doctrines. A newer example of the rich nation's wealthy businesses taking over the poorer agrarian people's lands and resources is shown by the moves in China. That country's businesses are now prevalent in Africa in a big way, developing mines and oil wells to name just two activities. Indeed, Trumpet.com warns of a Roman Empire-like imagining going on among leadership circles abroad, this time from Germany, which the Internet magazine states, which is using industrial and economic methods to gain control of poorer nations, with the boardrooms of their multinational corporations being their planning ground. German leadership literature has been found that shows a long-standing, continuing effort to rid Africa of British control and take over the mineral-rich land. The plan is to move corporations into Africa that will then set up city-states apart from the African rule there. The Germans then hope to use Africa's raw materials to fuel a great economic rise for Germans, while at the same time causing Africans to think that they are suffering from different causes. At this point, the European powers, at the same time as pursuing the above activities, also are offering solace and goods back to the African people as their defenders, which ultimately African lands have paid for, and how the Africans are being forced to offer Europeans, who have spent so many years excavating the soils of Africa and have now made multitudes of African people dependent upon them for sustenance, even greater deals that officially allow the European economies and probably other countries' stock market listed companies to take even more. The colonialists, therefore, have created a completely new culture of big business in an agrarian part of the world, who along with their future generations have been separated from their religious, artistic, familial, social, educational, individual, and life-sustaining ideals, becoming subservient to the incoming, over-consuming nations who pretend to serve the poor but only take away their culture. This type of behavior, according to Trumpet.com, is reminiscent of Pentecost. Furthermore, G8 modern industrialized nations have formed what is called the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition in Africa, acting as an organization concerned with famine and strife in the poverty-stricken continent. However, those modern governments associated with this alliance, according to an article in Redress Information and Analysis, are truly seeking control of African land, especially in the sub-Saharan most poverty-stricken areas, in order to gain land rights through corporate expansion into these areas to secure access to energy-rich lands. The new alliance described above is the front used to show concern and care for African people, while according to the article, the colonial expansionist businesses are trying to take control of the land's wealth. These plans include beginning a land tenure in Africa hand in hand with corporate expansion, and incredibly to come to own even the seeds that grow. Currently, Africans share seeds among nations to help their very small farmers develop vegetation and food. If this alliance succeeds, however, the article states, it will be able to copyright the seeds of the land, thereby assuring that the vegetation growth in Africa belongs to the corporations there, and therefore even the land under African people's feet is not truly theirs. One clearly sees that by taking control of food production, the colonialist and imperialist takeover of the lands of Africa is complete. The powers coming into Africa have always been there to rob gold, iron ore, other metals, and ivory, to name a few, and now those aggressors are there to own the foliage and food, as well as the energy products existing under the ground in the African nation. One wonders if there are any international laws on the books calling these acts illegal. When one studies this question, one finds that there exists a law called the Doctrine of Discovery, which gave Europeans authority as superior beings to the beings existing in other cultures to make legal claims of ownership and domination over the lands, assets, and peoples in places that they had discovered, quote-unquote discovered. This international doctrine dates back to the 15th century with roots in the Roman Church that specifically sanctioned and promised the conquest, colonialization, and exploitation of non-Christian territories and peoples. In December of 1960, however, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, which declared the subjection of peoples to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights, is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, and is an impediment to the promotion of world peace and cooperation. All peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Inadequacy of political, economic, social, or educational preparedness should never serve as a pretext for delaying independence. All armed action or repressive measures of all kinds directed against dependent peoples shall cease in order to enable them to exercise peacefully and freely their right to complete independence, and the integrity of their national territory shall be respected. Immediate steps shall be taken in trust in non-self-governing territories or all other territories which have not yet attained independence, to transfer all powers to the peoples of those territories without any conditions or reservations, in accordance with their freely expressed will and desire, without any distinction as to race, creed, or color, in order to enable them to enjoy complete independence and freedom. However, under English law, the taking of new territories outside of England, whether barren or inhabited, is allowable because the English believed that their morals were of the most high and allowed them to control others who they deemed not only as not as high morally, even when those less high populations existed in the disrupted territories for many, many years, and indeed were indigenous to those communities. The British legalized their ability to colonialize a country or territory when the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed the Colonial Laws Validity Act of 1865, also entitled An Act to Remove Doubts as to the Validity of Colonial or Indigenous Laws. This act subordinated all colonial or indigenous population laws native to the lands that the British held dominion over, to not go against any law of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, which held ultimate authority as to the laws of each colony they retained. In the 1920s, this act was repealed and 10 British colonies declared their independence from England. England also gave back territories in the years to follow. What the British state today is that their dominions, under the control of their Queen, have chosen to stay a part of the British Commonwealth. However, the types of activities described in this article previously of corporate takeovers with stock market approval of indigenous lands has taken the place of political or military takeovers of the land. The rule still in many agrarian cultures is that of the new colonialists and imperialists, the big business enterprises moving into those lands from many industrialized nations, with pockets brimming with money to have all the power necessary to take ownership, as it was taken in many previous years, of the riches of the agrarian lands. At this time, this author found no international laws against such actions. Another example of colonialism and imperialism that led to catastrophic environmental results occurred in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution of China, brought by the Russians. Their takeover of China led to a dangerous acceleration of desertification in China, when the Russians chose to build an extensive irrigation system connecting many Chinese households in the Gobi Desert region to rivers that flowed in the areas. This irrigation system, Chinese scientists say, took too much water from their rivers and caused them to dry out, leaving the Gobi Desert in very severe circumstances. Additionally, in the grasslands of the Gobi region, which acted as a water sink in the area and kept moisture there, the Russians adopted a policy of removal of these green plants in favor of cultivating soil for farming. The result was a loss of almost all of the moisture that existed in areas around the Gobi Desert. Because of the loss of the grasses and the rivers, native scientists say a growth of 500 to 800 square kilometers more of Gobi Desert spread and desertification occurs every year, causing one of the most terrifying and severe cases of desertification on the earth. The Gobi is known to produce winds so violent that they can engulf a human being and bury him or her, not to be found for weeks. While the U.S. cannot control other countries' colonialist or imperialist ventures that harm our planet, they can control U.S. business involvement. If any U.S. corporation listed on stock exchanges and gaining funding of exorbitant amounts each day can use that power to become involved in colonial or imperial-style land acquisitions, then the U.S. government should regulate these businesses in such a way as to stop any form of U.S. land conquest. These movements, if they occur, are against the formal doctrines of our past presidents and are truly un-American. If American businesses were to be made accountable this way, and stopped then, this author believes that such land ruination and environmental hazard would be stopped. Citations: Europeans' African Pillage, Trumpet, print edition, trumpet.com, July 2000, by Gareth Fraser. Quote, Aid to Africa, donations from the West mask $60 billion in looting of the continent. UK and wealthy states revel in their generosity while allowing their companies to plunder African resources, say NGOs, unquote. The Guardian, July 15, 2014, by Mark Anderson. Quote, the G8's commercial colonization of Africa, the new Wild West, unquote, redress information and analysis, exposing injustice, disinformation and bigotry, June 27, 2013, by Graham Peoples. Quote, calamity calling waterless world, China's ever-expanding desert wasteland, unquote, Global Post, December 16, 2013, by Benjamin Carlson. Thank you.